You know, if you've seen any of my videos on Sonic the Hedgehog, you might maybe, I don't know, sort of possibly be aware of the fact that I've been pretty vocal about liking the current direction for the Sonic series, as far as, you know, anything after the first movie, or more specifically Sonic Frontiers. And while I continue to enjoy 2020 Sonic stuff, like pretty much everything that's been coming out lately has been pretty much a banger. Shadow Generations was awesome, Movie 3 was awesome. I've been liking a lot of the stuff that has been coming out, but it's been a good while since Sonic Frontiers and its subsequent updates, DLC, came out, and I felt like just re-evaluating the whole thing, talking about the game for a bit, just checking on it all these years later and seeing how pretty much the genesis of this current era of Sonic the Hedgehog we're going through stands up nowadays. Because surprisingly, it's been like it's not been like a whole generation later or whatever, but it's been a good few years. We've gotten a lot of stuff since, and I think it's been long enough already where I can kind of like look back at it with a different perspective. I've figured out some things too. Back in the day when the game was still new, I made a few videos about it. Pretty much my best and worst video ever. It was one of my last video essays, and I put my soul into that one. Was this 40-something minute masterpiece about why Sonic Frontiers was freaking great, actually. And you know, as one of my last properly scripted video essays, it's a bit old by now, it's a bit outdated, it's not how I do videos nowadays, and there's a lot of little things like the audio or the way I wrote that script that I don't particularly like nowadays, but still, you know, 40-minute magnum opus. So it's simultaneously the best video I ever made and one of the worst videos I've ever made. I also remember doing one of these discussions back when the final update for the game released as well, and I shared a bit of my thoughts on that as well. Generally, still, Frontiers is a game that, you know, back when I first played it, it meant a lot to me, mostly because it was a return to a version of Sonic that I was really missing throughout the later 2010s, pretty much the entirety of the 2010s if you really think about it. You know, there's the whole conversation, like meta era and whatnot, and the different eras of Sonic and how those differ from each other and which ones are good, which ones aren't, yada yada. I don't really want to get too deep into the weeds here, but ultimately, Sonic Frontiers was a game that I acknowledged was very flawed from a technical standpoint, just very janky. I had a few issues from, like, mostly like budgetary type of stuff, but ideas-wise, creativity-wise, story-wise, just gameplay feel-wise and vibes. It's a game that I very much fell in love with back in the day, and it's pretty much like if Sonic Adventure was my childhood Sonic game, Sonic Frontiers was my teenage years Sonic game. 2022, I believe I was like 16. It felt like it really stood out. It was my 2022 game, pretty much. Maybe not even my favorite, but the one that just defines that era for me, or well, at least one of the bigger ones. DLC as well, it's kind of a bigger mess in some senses. It fixed some stuff, it made some other stuff worse, but I still came out of Frontiers thinking, damn, I was happy to see these characters again, I was happy to have a fun, big new Sonic game, and I was genuinely enthralled by the gameplay itself. I thought it was very fun, very addicting. Now, this video isn't gonna be a proper review or re-review of Sonic Frontiers. I didn't fully replay it for this. I just wanna start a conversation here. I felt like talking about Sonic Frontiers. I had a lot of time to think. I've seen different opinions, including that Jet video I watched on stream. And you know, lately I've been getting stuck on a lot of those bigger videos that I've been making. And I remember I can literally just sit down here and talk about anything I want, and there's nothing wrong with it. Plus, it's not like I ever really stopped playing Sonic Frontiers. I always like to come back to it, even if it's just to mess around. Even for one of my latest videos on Switch 2, I played a bit of Sonic Frontiers there just to record some footage for that video. So the game's been on my mind lately, and yeah, let's talk about it. I think part of growing up just in general is getting a more nuanced perspective on stuff you already knew. This doesn't just go for, you know, like big stuff, life itself. Oh, you grow up, you have a different perspective on life. That too, absolutely that too. But even with like specific things, you know, media, sometimes you watch a show or play a game and it'll be like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever watched, right? And you still might really like it later on, but as time goes, you have more time to think about it, have more time to let it sit in, and a few of its flaws do become more apparent over time. You know, people like to call this the honeymoon phase, where like something first comes out, you first get into it, it's all sunshine and rainbows, it's all amazing, but as time goes, things get more nuanced, and yeah, I've had a few of those thoughts regarding Sonic Frontiers itself, but as far as the wider Sonic community goes, I feel like that's been pretty prominent with it as well, because of, you know, the state of the entire franchise, pretty much. Sonic is at a point now where a lot of what people like or dislike about it is, I guess I want to say extrinsic. I don't know if that's exactly the word. You know, people like Sonic because of the characters, the vibes, the aesthetics. The gameplay is good, for sure. You know, the game structure itself is very important. If you have a broken game, then it's not fun. But Sonic as a character, you know, being partly directed to kids as well, and, you know, so much nostalgia being involved with it as well. Like, when people are discussing Sonic, they talk about characterization, they talk about character design, they talk about memorable moments, and whenever people talk about the gameplay, it's usually about making it feel cool. When people talk about momentum, about physics, about controls, there's a sense that, you know, when you're playing a Sonic game, it's supposed to feel a certain way. And that's not as objective as, you know, oh, the game is sound. It doesn't have any glitches, it has good graphics. You know, people want an idea from Sonic, a sort of vibe, a sort of feeling that's more complicated than just make the game good. You know, people are very particular about it. If Sonic's characterized in a certain way they don't like, suddenly it's a big deal, you know? And since Sonic itself has been juggled around so much by Sega when it comes to those ideas, those aesthetics, you know, you have classic Sonic, and that has a different vibe from modern Sonic. Sonic is a franchise that pretty much suffered for a good while there with an identity crisis, and what that means is that a lot of people are gonna like Sonic for very different reasons. All this is pretty much why people got so heated up about seemingly superfluous stuff when it comes to Sonic. You know, people from the outside in look at the Sonic community and see us discussing like Sonic's quill length. Like, oh, Sonic's quills are too short now, they should make them longer again. Since the movie's Sonic's speed powers have been visually represented by like this sort of electricity effect, and people are like very particular about like not liking that. It's all very minimal stuff that if you look from the outside in, it sounds kind of ridiculous. Like, we're crazy, it doesn't matter, it's just a visual effect. But that's because there's an attachment there. There's something particular about Sonic that people like, and, you know, people are gonna disagree about it because it is so specific, because it is so vibes focused. It's not objective at all, and it doesn't sound objective at all if you're trying to like properly discuss it even sometimes. This isn't even necessarily bad, nor is it really unique to Sonic. You know, a lot of older mascot franchises, you know, I'm thinking here like Spider-Man, for example. Like, people get heated up about different comic runs of Spider-Man, different suit designs, different eras, different interpretations. Pretty much every one of these big multimedia franchises that gets reinvented every few years has a degree of like fandom infighting regarding different eras and different interpretations of the characters. Sonic is just in a very unique circumstance because Sonic is not that old as a franchise. There hasn't been that much time to let those eras properly sit in as their own unique things. Everything that just comes out is the new version of Sonic. Since it isn't like properly separated into like reboots and stuff like that, people just get very particular and very attached. Like, oh, the one I used to like will never come back. Sonic is still very much just one single thing that's been changing and morphing into different things to adapt to the times. And you couple that with the fact that there have been some genuinely bad big Sonic games that affected the franchise's reputation, especially during like those 2000s early YouTube days. And it just means that people are very sensitive about it. People like to talk about it. Pretty much everyone in the fandom agrees that Sonic has been mishandled at some point. That they don't like Sonic in a certain era. As to what that era is, oh boy, you're gonna get different answers from pretty much everyone you ask. I personally like the kind of stuff Sonic Frontiers went for, and I was kind of like prying before Sonic Frontiers. That was like the peak of the 2010s. Oh, Sonic isn't trying anymore. Sonic is not being super unique and ambitious anymore. And I was frustrated about Sonic Forces being pretty much a budget game that ripped us off with almost false advertisements. And I saw like the Sonic IDW comics coming out, and those I like. And those were like the one thing that, oh, these are getting Sonic right. We need to see this in the game. So they brought the writer from that into the games. And I was very happy about that too. So Frontiers to me was just, you know, exactly what I wanted in the right time. So of course I loved it. When we talk about media criticism as a whole, like this can go far, you know. Artistic expression, ideas, what is good and what is not, what makes a good story in the first place. Like, that's a much bigger discussion than what we're gonna talk about here. And like, that's always gonna be a thing. Like, if you watch a movie and you like it, does that make it good, or does it just make it good to you? But I feel like it's especially prominent with Sonic, because the reasons why we like Sonic are very subjective. Because of the very, very particular circumstances Sonic is in. It's all over the place. And that's gonna result in these sporadic different opinions that don't always line up. People can like a new game and people can dislike a new game and have valid reasons for liking and disliking it, and they're both like in earnest, they're both correct, they're both true. That goes for everything, but like a lot of Sonic stuff, especially because just the way the series is. Sonic has just so much baggage now. Frontiers itself is a game largely influenced by these external factors, I feel. The story and character arcs for Frontiers, they're largely focused on addressing a few of the writing issues a lot of the characters had been facing in the previous few years, you know, addressing Tails' unexplained cowardice in Sonic Forces, addressing a few like the views on Amy being a little bit too clingy, a little bit too annoying to Sonic, and that's why she's a little bit more chilled out nowadays, figuring out an in-universe way to make Knuckles appear in more games without messing with his backstory and character goals. I've seen people describe Sonic Frontiers story as a Twitter story because a lot of it is just dealing with complaints you see about the series on Twitter. Don't even get me started on the gameplay itself. Frontiers' apparent development history, as far as we can track, is a genuinely fascinating one, and one that's also just very complicated and very messy. We've gotten a few interviews, we've seen people in the dev team talk about it, and also just leaks and stuff that came out surrounding the game, and the state the game itself came out on. We pretty much figured out that, you know, the mindset in the internal dev team was something like, oh god, we cannot fuck this up again. And that led to like a desire to innovate from the developers and do something different and something new. But they still like kind of messed it up, and they were having a lot of trouble with the new gameplay structure for Sonic Frontiers. And that just made like the dev team more horrified, and there was just genuine pressure where like, if this game didn't do well, it could have genuinely been like a bigger issue for the series as a whole. Like, not saying Sonic would die, the franchise, the series could be in a bit of trouble. It went through a lot of playtests, a lot of revisions. Early reports say the game was initially more focused on exploration itself and combat, rather than the more platform focus we got in the final version of the game, where the actual Sonic-like platforming would be only relegated to the cyberspace stages, and the open zones wouldn't have all those floating platforms and the tokens to collect. Those were added late in development in response to negative feedback from the playtesters. And even though the game had a good few years of development, a lot of it was just stuck on trial and error, figuring out what would work and what wouldn't work for the game. And genuinely, one thing that has changed about my views on this whole thing over these last few years is how I think that came about. Because I genuinely believe now that Sonic Frontiers initially was a bit cynically conceived. I don't think the developers were from the get-go trying to make something cool. I think they were trying to make something that would be successful. It's been pointed out a lot of the similarities between Sonic Frontiers and Zelda Breath of the Wild. Of course, aesthetically, you look at it for 1 second like, oh, green open fields, just like Zelda, for real, for real. But then you look at the story, and you have Sonic like messing with these 4 giant beasts, while figuring out these technologically advanced ancient civilization, while interacting with a different character per story section, per area. And you get to see a lot of those parallels, even the earlier gameplay structure itself, like Frontiers. If the open zones didn't have the platforming elements, it would have been a lot closer to something like Zelda Breath of the Wild. Over these years, these similarities have become way more apparent to me, and it makes me think that, oh yeah, probably they just wanted to do something like Breath of the Wild because Breath of the Wild sold well, it's a successful game, rather than trying to make something that works for Sonic specifically. It took a lot of trial and error and playtesting to figure out that no, that's not what we actually want, and no, that's not what would make a good game. I feel like a lot of those flaws that did come in the final product, that are a product of that massive development, are down to mishandling of the game itself, early on in development. The version of Frontiers that doesn't have the floating platforms, that doesn't have the elements that ended up in the final game that made it so much better, is a version of the game that probably wouldn't work, that I probably wouldn't enjoy as much. And the fact that they even thought that would be a good idea just goes to show that I don't think this game was exactly in the same wavelength as a lot of us fans, as I thought it was back when it first came out. Now, games are made by people, not companies. And as a fan of the final product, I'll be the first one to go ahead and defend the dev team for ultimately making a cool game. And I think, by now, after all these updates they tried to do to fix a lot of the game's issues, considering they did decide to go back and do a lot of these playtests and make sure the game was actually pretty good by the time it came out, I think by the end, there is, artistic value in this game. I think it is a cool game that was made in earnest. But it was a troubled project that doesn't just happen due to low budget. It happens because of a lack of vision as well. It happens because of mismanagement, because of troubled ideas. Now, that isn't to say Sonic Frontiers lacks creative spark. Honestly, I think one thing people don't give Frontiers enough credit for is its original ideas, its aesthetic, its art design. People like to meme about the environments for Sonic Frontiers looking like Unreal Engine, generic, default, grassy fields. And while I do think, the areas in general could have been a little bit more varied, they could have been just a little bit more inspired, I do think a lot of it was just intentional. Sonic Frontiers is not supposed to look like your typical Sonic game. Look at the story, look at the things it's trying to say. The idea is to put Sonic in an unfamiliar, weird world, and part of it is just making it look uncanny in a way. And I think that's part of the point. If you look at all the character designs, the robots, the ancients, even Sage, herself, the big original character for this game, they all don't really look like Sonic stuff, but they all look super cool as well. And you put them in this weird naturalistic environment, and man, I don't know, Sonic Frontiers is still kind of a vibe to me. I look at some of the art for the game, some of the environments and stuff. If you sit down and just look at Kronos Island, for example, at night, and you see the giant squid robot flying around with a trail behind its back, I'm man, I don't know, I think you guys forgot that this game actually looks pretty damn cool. It has its own unique mystique, so to speak, its own vibe, and it isn't exactly what Sonic should always be, but it works really well for what the game is going for. I think a lot of these unique aesthetics are what mask the kind of overt similarities to Zelda Breath of the Wild when it comes to story. I just feel like the art design, the iconography, especially the iconography, just Sonic fighting Giganto, the bosses and stuff, they're some of Frontier's strongest aspects. Also, the music, of course, for the bosses, especially the music. Aesthetics-wise, I just feel like Frontiers does stick the landing in a way that people kind of don't appreciate as much as I think they should, to be honest. But yeah, this is a game that really shows its seams. It really makes apparent that it was made with just a lot of duct tape, a lot of figuring things out as we go. Even despite the updates that were expressly made to fix some of the game's issues that were, literally free. While they do improve the game in a lot of ways, they also make it even more apparent how much of a rushed fix job a lot of the good elements of this game are. If you open Frontiers right now and start a new game, it's actually really funny. You're gonna be bombarded by little pop-ups letting you know all the new things the DLC added. And for someone who's playing the game right now, who just decided to play Sonic Frontiers, that wouldn't make any sense, oh, check out the new photo mode, check out the new combat challenge mode or whatever. I guess the game has to let you know, but it's so awkward. That's a game that still, despite everything, still feels awkward with all its little fixes to things. Updates aside, just look at the clearly rushed original ending for the game. The limited environments, the way you just have 3 types of environments, and then we have the cyberspace stages, and those are just reused from previous games. Not a game that exudes confidence, that seems like it was made without effort. It shows that there was a struggle to make the game the way it is now, but at least again, it also shows a genuine intent from the developers to make something cool, to make a game that probably somewhere along development became something the developers were actually passionate about, or that they actually really wanted to get right for the sake of, you know, the game itself, rather than just making money. Even across Frontiers developments, like, it was a long time between Sonic Forces and Sonic Frontiers, and probably like even during that time, the fan views on what Sonic should be changed as well. So they were fighting a bunch of different factors when they're specifically making a game to try to please the fan base and the general public. And honestly, if you ask me, to this day, Frontiers is still a fun-ass game. There's nothing that quite feels like popping up Frontiers on my PC here, picking up my controller, just chilling out to, you know, collecting tokens and doing the missions and filling out the map and stuff. It's a sort of almost relaxing experience. I don't really know how to say it. It's just a game that, if you're in the right mood, puts you in a very nice sort of flow state, and it's probably the Sonic game I jump first into replaying every time I really want to play something like it, because there's nothing quite like Sonic Frontiers. You have a bunch of different cool Sonic games with a stage structure, and those are also fun, those are also addicting, but if I want to play something like Sonic Frontiers that feels like Sonic Frontiers, there isn't anything quite like it, from Sonic or otherwise. This type of open world-ish action platformer that allows you to do tricks and stuff, just get lost in the game's world, in the way Frontiers makes me get lost. It's very particular to it, and because of that, I still have fun with it. I remember describing the appeal of this game, gameplay-wise, to a friend of mine, and he compared it to Spider-Man PS4, and how that game also has just a very big world where you just kind of fuck around, and because the movement is so fun, it ends up just being very addicting and very enjoyable to just clear checks in the map and fill it out and do all the different little missions, even if the gameplay itself is still somewhat simplistic. And yeah, it's the same logic, it's just that different itches are scratched by each of those games as far as movement and gameplay style goes. And yup, Frontiers is just a lot less polished than Spider-Man PS4 could ever be. Frontiers is jank as fuck, and that was true back in the day, and it is true now. Now I'm pretty tolerant to janky games. You know, I grew up playing older video games, and I feel like a lot of the time that kind of stuff was more accepted back in the day than it is now. As a long-time gamer, you start to get used to, you know, weird jumping arcs, clipping into stuff. You know, my favorite game is Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and that's an amazing, beautiful game that's filled with content, and it's probably a lot better made than something like Sonic Frontiers. But you know what that game also has? A lot of weird clipping into things, a lot of little gameplay jank stuff that to me is normal. It genuinely makes me wonder how many different games you've played if you haven't learned to deal with this kind of jank by now. That isn't me judging or anything. Like, I know there are lots of different polished games out there, maybe just don't want that from Sonic specifically, but like even older Sonic games, you know, Sonic Adventure, Sonic Heroes, those have their quirks as well. They have their own weird things that don't feel quite as solid, as precise as you'd hope they'd be. There's a degree of jank with a lot of different older games, and that includes Sonic 2. But it's still a flaw. It's still something that would make the game better if it wasn't there. So much so that once I got the game on PC, I pretty much got addicted to installing mods that fix the little issues with Sonic Frontiers' gameplay. I think there's a nod, like sort of resonance to almost perfect but very flawed media, where there's like, oh, this is great, but there's this one little thing that if I could change, it would be so much better. You know, but that's why I like making these kinds of videos in the first place. You know, stuff like me talking about, I don't know, Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon. Could be the definitive version of one of my favorite games, but it has that one little issue that I wish it could fix. Sonic Frontiers, we have a chance to fix a lot of the issues. Just install some movement mods, install some graphics mods, some fixes, and voila, now it's a sound video game. But it would be hypocritical of me to say that I just love Frontiers nonstop, while also spending hours of my life searching for and installing mods that fix Sonic Frontiers' big, obvious issues. You know, I talked about the updates and stuff and how they kind of make things a little bit more obvious, a little bit more awkward. The DLC somehow made the game more complicated with stuff like this, because now we have two endings, and each ending has its own good and bad qualities, meaning that neither of them is definitive, and we don't really have a definitive, just perfect version of Frontiers as ending. And that also fuels the whole, I just, if I could change this or that, and Even the existence of the DLC itself doesn't really make sense without context. So why are there two different versions of the ending? Why does one of them we just get by jumping into this ring? It doesn't make sense if you didn't know that, yeah, the ending was originally rushed, so they made this update to make a different version that it's at the very least a little bit more exciting, but it changes some stuff as well, so I wouldn't recommend you to play the newer ending before playing the original one. It's a mess. And you know what also doesn't really make sense without external context? You know, one thing about Frontier's story that's pretty interesting is its almost excessive use of little references to previous games. You know, Ian Flynn, one of the game's writers, the one that's pretty much, you know, known as a current big Sonic writer. He started writing for the Sonic Archie comics back in the day, then he went into IDW, and now he's working in the games themselves and the larger Sonic series as a whole. And one of his biggest, you know, almost like defining writing signatures, so sort of thing I think he likes to do a lot, is doing little callbacks to previous games in the form of, like, you know, little lines calling out proper nouns for different games, even when they maybe aren't really that necessary. Now, back when Frontiers came out, I loved all these little references, exactly because I was starving for this kind of stuff. I wanted Sonic to be more ambitious, to connect itself more to its wider lore. Again, I was pretty much primed to enjoy Sonic Frontiers when it came out, and that's part of why I loved it so much back in the day. It meant so much to me. But a lot of these little callbacks Ian Flynn likes to do have been receiving a lot more backlash lately. On one hand, I sort of agree, because, you know, now it's become obvious. Now we know that's an Ian Flynn thing, that he likes to do these little callbacks. And since it's a lot of proper nouns, they even like rewrote Sonic Generations to include more of these references, it gets a little awkward. And, you know, that breaks immersion. That means that if you're trying to just enjoy the game and suddenly they sort of randomly reference a weird thing from an older game, like, now you remember, oh, Ian Flynn did this, right? And suddenly you're not thinking about the story itself, you're thinking about the people who made it, you know? On the other hand, I still kind of like the references and the callbacks in some sense. I think there are different, you know, different cases, different scenarios where they worked and where they didn't work as much. One thing I hear a lot is like, no, Sonic games didn't do these back in the day, so why would they start doing it now? The best Sonic stories from like the early to mid 2000s were built on previous games at the time. Sonic Adventure is pretty much a sequel to Sonic 3's whole Echidna plot, and how much they reference the Angel Island and the Master Emerald. And then we have Gamerol coming back in Sonic Advance 3 when he was first introduced in Sonic Battle, and that being like a whole storyline. Artificial Chaos being an enemy in Sonic Adventure 2. That's a reference, of course, to Chaos itself in Sonic Adventure 1. They're good and bad ways to do these callbacks, and I don't think it's out of the series' range to do them. I feel like when done right, they're really, really good, and they can help a story a lot and can oddly enhance immersion, because it means, like, yeah, you're being rewarded for keeping up with these characters, you're being rewarded for keeping up with the lore, and it feels like this one big thing you're keeping up with, rather than just individual stories that barely connect at all. I mean, I'm a fan of the guy, I enjoyed a lot of his writing, so yeah, I'm likely biased too, but literally today's lesson with this video is bias is especially unavoidable when it comes to Sonic. So I'm just gonna roll with that. I think that the quirks of his writing are just becoming more and more apparent because of the vitriol and because they're so noticeable and they repeat so much. And a part of me does want to just say, oh, Ian Flynn, please dial it back, because now it's becoming kind of ridiculous how many little callbacks you're doing in ways that maybe are a little bit too awkward. But then I remember how the creative process goes. And I don't know, to me it just feels weird to walk up to a guy as like criticism and say, hey, stop doing this cool thing you clearly enjoy doing in your creative work because a few people on Twitter have caused me to be hyper aware about it. It's a little thing that ballooned into this big thing, and now it's awkward. Now it's a conversation. Not saying the guy is immune to criticism, I just think the callbacks and references are kind of harmless at worst, just kind of like, oh, funny, and really cool at best. Not all of them are hits, and people are just making this a bigger issue than it needs to be. And as long as he generally keeps it under control, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. If we keep moving forward thinking any sort of reference to a previous story in the series is a bad thing, we're in the wrong here. Even if it might be kind of his fault that Ian Flynn might overdo it a little bit. And even after all this time, I think Frontier's story is a memorable one, limited and awkward at times, For sure, a lot of the cutscenes are just standing around and talking. The environments, thanks to the game structure itself, are very limited. We don't go to that many different places. But to me, it landed. It's solid, and it has a lot of really cool, solid ideas. I still haven't forgot about it to this day, and I still think about it a lot. Much like the gameplay jank, it's always been like that with Sonic, and we all waited up. You know, if you look at Sonic Adventure 1's awkward cutscenes and localization, like, if you ask me, that's worse, you know? I was replaying Adventure for a stream recently, and like, that game's cutscenes don't flow well. That dialogue is awkward as hell. And like, we accept it because it's a product of its time. It's because the game was made like this, and of course we should have higher standards, but most of us love Sonic Adventure 1's story. Most of the people criticizing Sonic Frontier's story love Sonic Adventure 1's story. I love Sonic Adventure 1's story, despite all of these little quirky things about it, and I'm willing to do the same for Sonic Frontiers too. Simple as that. A lot of what Frontier's issues come down to is it's another Sonic game, and much like Sonic Adventure or Sonic Unleashed, pretty much every Sonic game has a few little awkward things about them. That's part of the reason why the series is so scrutinized and criticized, but it's each game's unique elements that resonate with the players, that stand out and make it so we love them so much despite all of that. Sonic Unleashed has a few structural issues, some progression issues. Adventure 1 is, you know, starting to show its age, even though it's still like pretty damn great if you ask me, especially the original Dreamcast version. Fate Frontiers itself will also start showing its age more and more, being the first open zone game, being so janky, trying to do a lot of different things, and obviously almost failing at a lot of them. But much like Sonic Adventure, it'll still have a special place in many people's hearts, including mine. The rewiring it did to my brain simply just doesn't go away like that.